Hey, Kerith online family, good to see you all, and my name is Pete. If you don't know me, I'm married to Alex. We've got two girls, Maya and Alia, and we have been part of Kerith Community since 2005. Today I want to let you in on a snippet, a window of my life, something where I'm maybe being a bit honest and vulnerable, but I want to let you know about one of my quirky and also bad habits. Because everyone's normal till you get to know them, right? It's true. And so for me, one of my quirky habits, and you'll see it come up in the photo in the background here, is you can see how I have my breakfast. Now, some of you might think, what's wrong with that? But I get quite a bit of grief from my family about using a chopping board for my breakfast instead of a normal plate. There's some good reasons for this. Firstly, our kind of side plates for our breakfast are a little bit on the small side, so you can only really squeeze a bit of toast on there. But I quite like this chopping board because it's kind of, smallish, but it almost acts like it kind of doubles up as a tray. So if you want to move it around, you can have your mug on there, you can have your toast on there, you could maybe have a piece of fruit on there. But really, I don't always use this. So occasionally I'll use a plate, and you'll see that in a second. But the reason why this is not just a quirky habit, but is also a bad habit, is that I also quite often forget and leave it on the table. And you'll see a picture here from my daughter. She took a picture of my breakfast and sent it to me on WhatsApp. And she said, I'm going to take a photo and send it to you every time you leave your breakfast stuff on the table. Kiss, kiss. And so it feels a little bit like kind of tables turned in terms of parenting. Quite often you can end up nagging your kids about doing this kind of stuff, bad habits of leaving stuff around the house. And so it's kind of role reversal, and a little bit of just for a bit of fun, thought I'd throw a bit of a pro parenting tip in here. So I've tried to give up on nagging, and one of the things which I try to do is say, if they leave stuff around, like a packet of crisps, whatever it might be, strewn in the car, left on the table, on the floor, I've just decided I'm not going to nag them anymore, and I'm just going to pick up that crisp packet, wander upstairs and put it in their bed, so they find a nice little treat for them when they when they get into bed at night. And normally what happens is that piece of rubbish ends up in the bin. And the only problem with this is that now I'm fully expecting perhaps my breakfast plate or the chopping board to end up in my bed. So you can kind of gamify it a bit, it's kind of fun. But in terms of the rest of us, we all know that this isn't just me, that we all have some quirky and bad habits. And I just thought we could maybe take a bit of fun and have a bit of fun with this. Maybe just if you're on your own today, maybe you could just have just to think about this for 30 seconds about what are some of your kind of quirky or bad habits, or maybe text a friend and tell them this, you're kind of confession is good for the soul, right? So maybe just for a bit of fun, you could do that. But if you're in pairs, or if you're at home with maybe your partner or your kids or whoever, maybe you could just take 2 or 3 minutes just to share about what is your quirky habit. And I'm sure if it's with your family, they're going to be already telling you. But in this kind of quick break, no marital arguments. You're also not allowed to use the words never or always. If you've been on the marriage course, we're kind of encouraged not to use those words. So don't want any arguments in this 2 minutes. But anyway, go for it. So I hope you found that some good discussion. I hope I haven't caused any arguments, but the reality is we all have good habits, some bad, some good. And a lot of the time these bad or quirky habits we've done for years, and mostly unconsciously. We don't intentionally plan to do a lot of these things, but we just do them. And quite often when we start a new year, so we're in January 2023, often you can hear preachers about, resolutions, or like starting something fresh, starting something new. But how do we form those habits when so often, even with the best intentions, we know that we can just fall back into old patterns, probably by the time February hits. And although sometimes funny, most of us recognise that there are some things that we would like to stop or start, but can't, because especially some things which are more harmful or maybe even addictive. So, we might have some things which are kind of funny or, quirky, but the reality is in life there are some things which are actually quite serious, and we really want to stop doing, but just finding ourselves that we can't. And as followers of Jesus, we are called to order our lives around spiritual practices and disciplines. And I want to introduce us today to the concept of a rule of life. And you could also call it habits of life. And what is a rule of life? Where does that kind of concept come from? And I don't want us to immediately kind of maybe get put off by the word rule or intimidated by that. We don't mean like legalistic rules here. It's actually something which is quite the opposite. It's really something that is supposed to bring freedom in our lives and the freedom to live life to the full. And a rule of life, really, it's a call to order our entire lives in such a way that the love of Christ comes before everything else. And in doing so, the quality of our lives holds the possibility of being transformed so it's like a gift, not only to us, but to the people around us, our families, our friends, our communities. So where does this term come from? This word rule. It comes from the Greek word, which actually the word rule means trellis. And what is a trellis? Well, a lot of those, if we've maybe used one or involved in gardening or seen them around, is a tool that enables maybe a vine or a flower to grow and get off the ground and grow upwards with structure, and allowing it to maybe produce fruit or just become, be able to flower. And it's essentially like a scaffolding that helps support it and give it structure. And in the same way, a rule of life for us is like a trellis that helps us to grow in Christ and become more spiritually fruitful. And another way you could simply put it is that really it's an intentional and conscious plan to keep God at the centre. And I would say in my preparation for this, I just really felt that word intentional was something which is really kind of key in today's message. And you'll see that more as I kind of bring it out in some of the passages I'm going to share and some of the quotes I'm going to share. I want to look at a picture here. This is a picture of our front of our house. And you can see here there's kind of our front door, and on just to the right of it, we've got a kind of a long, thin trellis. And my wife decided she wanted to plant a climbing rose, and which was maybe, about a foot high when we bought it. But these things grow fast. I didn't realise quite how quickly they grew. And if you didn't have a trellis there, this thing would probably just flop over and die. But what we realised is we had to train it. We had to prune it as it kind of really kind of goes for it in summer. When it started growing in a crazy wrong direction, you have to kind of thread it back through. And we did that because we wanted to intentionally make sure that it was going in the direction we wanted it to go, and for it to flower when the right time was for it to flower. And the reality is that actually very few of us have a conscious plan and an intentional plan like we want for our plants. We don't have that for developing our spiritual lives. Most of us are not intentional but functional. We know that a lot of the time we can live lives like we're on like a car on autopilot. We have crammed schedules, we have demanding jobs, endless to-do lists, we have constant noise around us and anxieties, and these keep speeding us up rather than slowing us down. And we all know, isn't it? It's easy to kind of go through the motions of life. The reality is every person has a rule of life, but it's so often unconscious. And these things are good things. They might just include, like, say, going to church or going to small group or praying for 5 minutes in the day. And these are all good things. But even with those things, we can be going through the motions. But I think, however, we know that most of our existing practices, like these things, are just not enough to keep us afloat in what is the ocean of the beast of this 21st century world that we live in. Is that quite often we can be fighting against a really strong current. And without the anchor of this rule of life, which we're going to really kind of get into, especially over these next 4 weeks that are coming up, and I'll explain what's going to be happening in these weeks coming up, is that without this anchor of a rule of life, it's almost impossible, and eventually we find ourselves unfocused, distracted, hurried, and spiritually adrift. At this point, I would want to mention a book which is becoming a bit of a life book to me called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And this is by an American author called John Mark Comer. And I think this is going to be one of those books that I'm going to be going back to almost every year because it's just so full of just great stuff, all to do with this rule of life, about habits, about how we stay emotionally healthy and spiritually alive. You can see that in the kind of the subtitle of this book. And I don't know about you, but I want to stay emotionally healthy and spiritually alive in this crazy world we live in. And there's some interesting quotes in there. I'm just going to pick out a few of these kind of like really simple one-liners. And some of the things he says here are quite poignant. He says, Jesus was never in a hurry. Hurry is the death of prayer. And even slightly, I've listened to the audiobook of this, and he says this slightly jokingly, but I think there's some truth in it, is that hurry is of the devil. Hurry is a disordered heart. We walk with God, not rush. And we are so rushed, we settle with a mediocre version of faith. The need of the hour is a slow down spirituality. I also want to share a couple of other quotes. One is from the author of the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality books and course called Pete Scazzero. He says this: most Christians talk about prayer, but don't pray. Most believe the Bible is the word of God, but have little idea what it says. And I've also been reading another book recently called The Divine Conspiracy by a well-known author called Dallas Willard. He's a bit of a heavyweight theologian. And he says this: it is now generally acknowledged that you can be a professing Christian and a church member in good standing without being a disciple. It's crazy, right? That sounds mad. How is that possible? He says we fail to be disciples only because we do not decide to be. We do not intend to be disciples. It is the power of decision and the intention over our life that is missing. And you can see that word again there, intention, is that I think a lot of the time it's so easy to have maybe good intentions, but a lot of the time we just don't follow through with that real determination of just saying, I'm aware of what's missing and I'm going to really follow through. And this is why we're talking about the rule of life, because we really want to help people really think about those things and to make those things happen for good, so that it does give us freedom and not just a set of rules. Yeah, so I found that when I read a lot of these quotes, I was just like, wow, a bit like the Bible says that the word of God is a double-edged sword and that it cuts to the heart. It felt quite cut to the heart, if I'm honest, that a lot of the time I can talk about having a relationship with God, but actually really a lot of the time I'm living a hurried life and I'm not really intentionally living it. And the quote from John Mark Comer really resonated with me about that we can so easily settle for a mediocre version of faith. But the good news is that there is another way we can choose to live in the hurry of the 21st century, and that nurturing a growing spirituality with depth, so a lot of the time we can kind of live without really that much depth. It doesn't automatically happen, and it requires a thoughtful, conscious and intentional plan. And to plan well requires we go back to the Bible, and we're going to look at a little bit of church history as well today to consider the roots of what is this hidden treasure called the rule of life. So I want us to look at, very briefly, a little bit in the Old Testament about the story of Daniel. Then we're going to go on to look at a little bit of a snippet from the Gospels, from the life of Jesus and his disciples, a little 24-hour period, window into their lives, and then also a little bit of church history thrown in. So if you're ready, we're going to dive into Daniel 6, chapter 10, and we're going to read that in a second. And Daniel was somebody who had a plan. He had a rule of life. And, he didn't leave his interior life to chance, which is what we can do a lot. He knew that going to church once a week with a little bit of prayer and Bible thrown in just wasn't going to cut it. And he knew what he was up against. He was up against the equivalent of this modern kind of crazy hurried world. He was up against the beast of Babylon in his day, and King Nebuchadnezzar and all that was going on there in terms of people being put into slavery. And we read this in Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. It says, Daniel went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. He was clearly engaged in prayer, and a bit like if you've done the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality course, it talks about this thing called a daily office, which is about kind of engaging with God purposefully at different points through the day, maybe 3 or 4 times in the day. And he fed himself spiritually. He didn't wait to be fed or spoon-fed by church leaders or people around him. He didn't rely on the spirituality of others. This was a really key part of his rule. And before we dive into the New Testament, to kind of investigate where we see some of these things of the rule of life now, I just want to explain what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks. Is we're going to be breaking down the rule of life into 4 sessions, and really because a rule of life really can be summarized in 4 things. The first thing is prayer or loving God. The second one is loving people or relationships. The third one is work, and the fourth one is rest. And what I want us to do whilst we're reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, is I want to see if you can identify one of those 4 things. So maybe you can pick out something to do with loving God, something to do with loving people, something to do with where you see work involved, something where you see rest involved. So we're going to read this and just maybe make some comments as we go along. So let's read. It's Mark chapter 1, verse 29. It says, as soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So even in those first just few words, we can see a synagogue. That's a place where prayer and relationships happen. And then James and John in someone's home, Simon and Andrew. There's friendship and family going on there. Relationships were very key to the followers of Jesus and Jesus himself. Let's keep reading. It says, so he went to her, took her hand and helped her up. The fever left her and she began to wait on them. And we can see there, hey, healing was a part of their ministry and Jesus' ministry. That was part of their work. And we can see that as part of their rule of life. And then it goes on. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. Again, you can see it's all about people. It's people focused. And we can see the work of Jesus going on there. Again, there's healing involved. He drove out many demons. Again, more work. But he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. And then verse 35, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. So we can just see in that verse as well that how Jesus was committed to a rule of life of prayer and solitude, which you could say was also rest for him. Then Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, everyone is looking for you. Jesus replied, let us go somewhere else to the nearby villages so I can preach there also. That is why I have come. And you can see what is happening there is that Jesus recognized that there was limitations in terms of what him and the disciples were doing, and that he couldn't please everyone. And so there's something of rest and margin in there where that was important to them as part of their rule of life. And then finally, it says, so they travelled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. So again, synagogue was part of their rule of life. And obviously there were people there and they were healing people, and that was part of their work. So we can see a real kind of mixture of those 4 elements of a rule of life. And just very briefly, I just wanted to dive into a quick bit of church history. And then we're going to look about how we can apply this into our lives. So at the end of the 3rd century, men and women withdrew to deserts to seek God. And if you've ever heard of the term desert fathers, this is where that phrase comes from. They were people who wanted to free themselves from distraction. Even though they didn't have smartphones and some of the things that we have today, there were still things that they felt distracted them from God. And later, some of these people formed communities, organising their daily life around these 4 areas. And really, these were the first people who used this term, and they called it a rule of life. There was Pachomius in 300 AD. He created the first known rule of life for monastic communities in Egypt. Spiritual seekers learned from these desert fathers like Pachomius, and they returned home to create their own. And there was Benedict in 500 AD, who some of you might have heard of. He wrote the most widely known of monastic rules, which has shaped Western monasticism and church history over the last 1500 years and continues to guide people from all traditions. So that's a little bit of an insight into Old Testament, New Testament and Jesus and his disciples, and a little bit of an insight into where the rule of life came from and how I guess that term came about from church history. So I wanted to just think about, how do we get started? What does the rule of life look like for me and you today? And how can it really kind of benefit us and help us to grow in our faith and grow that depth in our faith? I want to just share, I thought it might be helpful before we really kind of look at maybe some specific applications for each of us, because I know everyone's going to be in a slightly different place with something like this, is that I thought it'd be helpful maybe to share my experience about doing the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality course, which very much talks all about these spiritual practices and how to create a rule of life. And that's what I did at the end of 2021. And I'm going to look at a slide here, and this is my 2022 attempt at a rule of life. So I wrote this just at the end of 2021, and please don't judge me. There's lots of things in here, and I think I probably bit off more than I could chew. I haven't included everything in here because I think it probably wouldn't be helpful if I wrote everything in here. I know it's probably far too much to go through, but it's also a lesson for me to learn that actually I think probably if you're writing a rule of life is probably to start with, less is more. That's basically what I'm trying to say. But the reality is I think I probably failed at more things than I probably succeeded in. So first part of the slide is loving God and prayer. And I was really kind of struck by some of the stuff in the EHS course about that kind of daily office, a bit like Daniel. And I wanted to do something in the morning, something in the middle of the day, and something in the evening. So a lot of us have heard about the Lectio app. That's one of the courses which is coming up, and I wanted to try and commit to that. There's actually a 24/7 prayer app. This is one of the things which I really liked, is that you can kind of get notifications and it kind of pings up to say, hey, don't forget to pray. And for me, that's been really helpful. And then a kind of maybe a reading, examine thing in the evening. And then something weekly I wanted to try and throw in was try and do something as a family, like a weekly memory verse. And then in terms of the work stuff, I wanted to set, so there's, I guess you could say setting a rule of life is almost a bit like trying to set habits and set a goal. And I think for me, I was never really a great reader when I was younger, and I wanted to try and get into creating a habit of reading books, not only books about faith, but business books. Being really intentional about serving. I really wanted to see if I could write 2 books last year and also hire 2 new people in our business. So there's some things there which you might find helpful or not helpful, and I'm not going to tell you yet what I managed to do and what I didn't manage to do. In terms of rest, to be honest, this is probably one of the ones which I struggle with the most. If I'm honest, I am someone who finds it hard to stop and relax, and so I feel this is an area which I really need to work on. There's a lot in EHS and also in John Mark Comer's book about Sabbath. And I really wanted to explore, what does that look like today? How do we do Sabbath in the 21st century? So much digging to do around there. This was kind of during lockdown, and it was coming out of lockdown. I've just not been doing very well with regards to exercise. I really wanted to get into the gym, and so for me, that was one of the things I really wanted to get good at. And there's another couple of things there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about one of those in just a second. And then in terms of relationships, I would also say probably after the rest, this is the one which I'm not so good at, is because I'm quite task focused, and I really need to make sure that I know that if I don't plan it in, it probably won't happen. And so day lunch is just making sure I'm intentional about spending time with Alex during the week, calling my brother because I'm rubbish picking up the phone and ringing family. My brother recently moved to the States, so I'm like, at the very least, like keeping the bar low, once a month, call my brother. Band of Brothers is just a men's group I'm a part of, and then doing something with my girls Adventurous once a year. So that was my attempt at a rule of life. And what I thought might just pick out 1 or 2 things is that I wanted to focus on one thing that went really well and why. And like I said, kind of coming out of lockdown, my gym had closed. And I was also struggling on and off with my mental health, and a bit of a quick plug here for the Hope and Depression course. something that was found hugely helpful for me personally, and realised that actually exercise is not only brilliant, obviously, for your physical being, but also massively important for your mental health. So for me, it was a huge kind of top line kind of rule of life commitment that I really wanted to make sure I was broke into that habit of doing it regularly. And I just wanted to talk very briefly about a book called Atomic Habits. This has been like a kind of a best-selling book recently. It's not written by an author of faith as far as I'm aware, but to be honest, you could potentially call it like atomic rule of life, because this is the kind of stuff which is really about how to, this, it's quite a big book, quite a long book. There's some great stuff in there, and I just want to pull out a couple of things. I want to talk about 2 principles from his book about how really you can make habits stick. And he talks about habit tracking and habit stacking. And for me, in terms of the gym, I thought, right, I'm going to have a go at this thing called habit tracking. And so what I did is I actually bought myself a really basic cheesy calendar. This one is rural Britain, and it was literally just like 12 sides with a nice picture and a bunch of things. And you can see here I've just literally ticked off every day that I've gone to the gym, tried to kind of aim for 3 times a week. And for me, it's and I think you'll find as well if you give this a go, is that there's something satisfying about trying to stick to a new habit and then ticking it off. And I decided also intentionally not to use my phone. I know this works for some people. I didn't want to habit track on my phone. You can get habit tracking apps if you're interested in that. But I already look at my phone too much, and I wanted something physical on the wall that I could literally get home and tick off and see every day, and kind of be staring me in the face every day. And so for me, one of the things it said, which really kind of stuck out to me in this Atomic Habits book, was that you want to try and find something which you just unconsciously do every day, and then add the habit to that. So for me, it was literally the first habit of the day, which is getting out of bed. And also, in terms of making the new habit easier, is removing any barriers. So the barriers for me was all my gym clothes being in the drawers and on hangers. So I thought, what I'm going to do night before, all gym stuff right by my bed. So in the morning, my habit is going to be get out of bed, gym clothes immediately on, and then go downstairs, have breakfast, leave my chopping board on the table, forgetting to put it in the dishwasher, which was my bad habit, go to the gym, get the gym done, come back, and then tick it off. And the aim was to do that every week. And if I was to kind of flick through that calendar, you'll see that I was really committed. I was really intentional. And this is the thing which I really want to kind of drive home, is that if you want to kind of see a new habit formed, I would really encourage you to try this. Not just for January and that kind of New Year's resolution, but tick it off every day for every week, or once a week, or whatever it is that you're going to stick to, and then look at it at the end of the year and go, wow, look what I've achieved. But then the other cool thing is habit stacking. And so what he talks about in the book is that basically once you've nailed this one habit, once you know you've got this kind of conscious, intentional habit that you're really pleased with, then it's kind of happening. So for me, I'm going to the gym Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays. It's a non-negotiable now. That is what I'm going to do, come rain or sun, cold or warm. And he kind of talks about when you've done habit A, then try to start habit B and kind of stack them together. And so for me, the thing which I wanted to do, which I'd kind of talked about in my list, was I was really keen to just be a better reader. And so I thought, every time I go to the gym, I'm then, before I go home, and he kind of talks about like kind of chucking in some rewards in there, because then it helps you to kind of stick both together. So I just thought I'm going to treat myself to a nice coffee and then read a book for half an hour. And that's really what has helped me to then make this second habit stick as well. So then my habit became get up, put my gym kit on, have breakfast, leave my plate on the table, go out the door, then realise I've left my plate on the table, go back in, put the plate in the dishwasher, still working on that one, then going to the gym, and then getting myself a nice coffee, having half an hour to read, then going home and then ticking it off. And it's amazing how this stuff from James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, really does work. And actually, I just think God's really in that. God wants us to be intentional, and he wants to help us to make those habits stick so that we can form a rule of life that is good for us. Now, I can hear some of us maybe saying, in response to this, Pete, I am not a schedule person. I'm too busy. I'm not a planner. I'm more the spontaneous type. I don't want to be held down by like a calendar or habit tracking. I don't do calendars. I don't do diaries. I can hear all those kind of possible complaints. And I want to counter that with some of the things which John Mark Comer says. One of the things that he says that following Jesus has to make it onto your schedule. And, the reality is we schedule what is important to us. We will schedule to go to the doctors. For some of those of us who might kind of be anti kind of schedule and more kind of spontaneous, we all have to go to the doctor at some point, and we put it in our diary. We commit to that time. We don't want to let ourselves down, or if we're taking our child, we don't want to let them down by missing it. And that we can suffer if we don't go through that. And he also says most of us are too busy to follow Jesus. And he goes on to say, are we too busy to have a friendship? Are we too busy to be married? Because he says, relationships, they take time, right? Relationships take time. And what I want us to consider right now is, I'm just going to suggest 6 really simple things that could help you on in your journey. And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be putting into action, and maybe we're going to be encouraged to maybe do just one thing out of those 4 parts of the rule of life, which is loving God, loving people, work and rest. And one of the things, the first thing I'd say is, hey, you might be watching this maybe for the first time. Maybe you've never been to church before, and you might be thinking, what are they talking about? What is this rule of life stuff? This does sound a bit religious to me. First thing I'd encourage you to do is I would say, hey, check out Alpha. And you'll see that on the slide there. If you've maybe got questions about faith, I would say this really is the first thing for you to do. I'd probably just say, hey, don't even think about anything I've said for the last 20 minutes. This is what I would prioritize for you. And we've just started a course. I'll just say, hey, come and get stuck in. You get to enjoy a nice meal, ask questions, and just be in a very no-pressure environment to ask all kind of questions about faith. And then the second one I would say is do the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality course. It literally will be transforming for you. It's one of those courses that I would say is one of my favorites. I'm maybe a bit biased, but I would say if you want to really grow and develop in your relationship with God and get some depth in your relationship with God, this really is a go-to. And I think everyone should do it at some point. The third thing is maybe don't go ahead and buy like a calendar like I did. I've just recently downloaded this for this year, which is a 2023 single page. Found it on Google somewhere, and you can see there I've already started habit tracking something new. Not going to tell you what that is. I don't think that's important right now, but why don't you try this? Just maybe choose one thing that you think by the end of this year, I would love to be doing this thing, whether it's weekly, maybe just keep it really simple. Tick that one thing off a week. Or if you maybe feel maybe more adventurous like myself when I did the gym, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. But don't try and do too much at once. Just pick one thing. I think if anything I've learned is just, it's so easy to try and do too much too quickly. So start simply and build slowly. So maybe you want to ask someone to keep you accountable, but maybe just put that calendar in a place where you'll see it every day to remind you to tick that thing off. Number 4 is maybe you're already doing well with some habits, and I would encourage you to try that thing of habit stacking. So you've done habit A, you've nailed that. Now you want to try and nail habit B. Try and see if you can put them together. Try and think of creative things to remove barriers and maybe to kind of reward yourself in that kind of combination of 2 things in order to make that second thing stick. So I don't know, it could be something like I've prayed for 10 minutes this morning, now I'm going to treat myself to a nice healthy smoothie. And I don't know, you can be more creative than me. Number 5, I would say, why don't you have a go at writing a rule of life? Maybe you have done the Emotionally Healthy course. Why don't you try and stretch yourself for 2023 and think of maybe at least one thing for each of these boxes. Or maybe you just want to wait for the next 4 weeks of preaching as we go through these, and maybe you can then decide which one thing do I really want to nail in each of those boxes. Because we all actually have a rule of life. Whether you realise it or not, you already have a rule of life that you go through every day. And for most of us, that is unconscious, but it's just not written down. So why don't you try writing it down? One thing can be doing this can be quite revealing and challenging. So why don't you nail your colours to the mast or to the wall and pin it up and look at that weekly as well. And then finally, there's a quote here by a lady called Margaret Gunter, and she talks about how once you have a rule of life, we need to review it. She says, a good rule of life can set us free to be our true and best selves. It's a working document, a kind of spiritual budget, not carved in stone, but subject to regular review and revision. And I'd say that's why it's really important to kind of get away from that word rule being like maybe hard or harsh, but actually it's something which is flexible, something that's supposed to be freeing and not kind of that you're completely kind of rigid with. And there's two things that I would say in this when you come to review it every year, if you're kind of getting into that place of really wanting to be really intentional about this rule of life, is that you can simplify or you can stretch. And for me, I know that I need to simplify, I need to prune some stuff out, and I need to review what needs to be changed or removed. And then maybe for you, you maybe want to stretch yourself. Maybe you think maybe you've written just one thing in each of those boxes. Well, maybe in 2024 you want to commit to 2 in each of those boxes. So for me, for my rule of life this year, I know I'm going to be doing some culling. I'm going to be getting rid of some stuff I know that wasn't very realistic, and I've got some work to do there. But I just want us to take a moment, just before we end and before I pray, is to think about just putting yourself in your shoes in a year's time. Just imagine that we're in January 2024. What habit would you have loved to have done every week for the whole of January 2023 that you would be massively proud of if this time next year you had kind of ticked it off and you'd done some intentional habit tracking? Because I want us to imagine the difference that will make for you, not only emotionally, but spiritually, maybe even physically good for you, for your health, but also maybe, like I said at the beginning, that it can be a gift. It can be a gift not only to you, but to people around you, that people might need to start to see the change in you. People might start to ask questions, and people might want to know, who is this God that you follow? And you know, that can have much wider impact. And I want us to imagine that everyone who watches this online, everyone who hears this message on a Sunday, just imagine if hundreds, thousands of people committed to one thing, and that in 1 year's time, that would be community transformation. If everyone was doing one new habit that impacted their spiritual life for the better. There's going to be some follow-up where I think you'll be able to get access to a booklet which will give you some prompts for this and some space to write in. Hopefully you'll be able to download it online. I know it's going to be available in person at church. So why don't we just take a moment just to pray, and then we're done. So Father, we are really thankful for the example that you have set in Jesus, and the example of Daniel, and through church history. And Father, we ask that you'll help us to intentionally choose habits of prayer, work, rest, and relationships that will do us good. And we ask for transformation in us, transformation in me, transformation in you, and that your kingdom will come. Amen.